Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's presentation. Today, we're going to be talking about resin tables and working with epoxies. I'm James Muccio, and I'm here with Sonia Lau to present to you. So, just outline of today's presentation, we're going to talk about OCal, who we are and what we do. We're going to go through working with epoxy resins and how they make these beautiful looking tables here. And we're going to talk about the health effects and exposures, and then we're going to talk about controlling the exposures.
The Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, otherwise known as OCAL, is a health and safety association funded under the prevention section of the Ministry of Labour, Training and Skills Development. OCAL is a free service offering clinical and prevention services. We are not for profit, in other words. We assist with vulnerable workers, high hazard exposures, small companies, not for profit organizations, basically any type of organization under the sun. We try within our capacity to help anyone and everyone. Referrals come from healthcare professionals, joint health and safety committees, advocates, and workers. Again, anyone.
So what does OCAO do? Well, OCAO is unique in that we have a medical service for workers that have been denied compensation claims. So they come to us to get medical proof that their injury or occupational disease is work-related. We have a group service. This is where we would go to a workplace and work with the Joint Health and Safety Committee or management or workers on health and safety issues in regards to industrial hygiene, ergonomics, or anything the workplace may need help with. We also have an inquiry service where anyone can call us with any health and safety issue, and we can help them try and answer all their questions. So we also do a lot of outreach and education, such as this presentation, where we attempt to educate workers on the hazards that they're working with. And when we're not busy doing those four things, we do a little bit of research on the side. So throughout Ontario, we have clinics, and one way or another, these clinics cover the whole province. So right now we have clinics located in Ottawa, Thunder Bay, Sudbury, Toronto, Hamilton, Sarnia, and Windsor.
We chose this critical topic because there isn't a lot of information on working with epoxies in this manner, the resin tables, for folks working in manufacturing or at home. When we were conducting our research, for example, just basic search criteria, etc., there isn't much that comes up except for suppliers that are providing information for users of the epoxies, etc. So that's why we thought that it would be best to provide this to our clientele so that they can stay safe and healthy while building these wonderful tables. There's a lot of other things that are also built with the epoxies as well, but we wanted to focus on these because these are the latest hype.
So epoxies, they're also known as polyepoxide or epoxy resin systems. So it's the combination of epoxy resin and a curing agent. So the curing agent is also known as a catalyst or most commonly referred to as the hardener. So you have the two liquids that are mixed together, and when they're poured into a mold, they dry or cure, as we call it, and they harden into the hard resin. And as you saw in some of the other pictures, you get that, the middle of the table or the dish. Um, and so looking at, the instructions for various products, there's different drying times right here on this specific one. We have 24 hours. We're going to talk about a little bit later on about the drying and curing and why it has to be completely cured. And I think there's many factors that go into the curing or drying process. You know, it probably depend on the thickness um, and how much you pour and the temperature in the room for the curing time. But basically, you want it to be completely cured before you start doing any other work on it. So part of the process during this is, once it's dry, what happens is bubbles can form as it's drying or as it's being poured. So a lot of times they, while doing this, to get rid of those little bubbles in there, they'll use a blowtorch. And what this does, it heats up the material again and it smooths it out. So it gets rid of those bubbles and imperfections. Um, and as we know, when you heat something up, there's always hazardous decomposition products. So some of the ones we identified from this process include carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, methane, small quantities of hydrogen, and formaldehyde. And just to note that formaldehyde is a carcinogen. So later on in the presentation, we're going to get into, ventilation and things we can do to control the exposures, but just highlighting that formaldehyde is a carcinogen here. And the last thing is volatile organic compounds. These are basically a group of chemicals that are carbon-based. There's hundreds of examples of volatile organic compounds, or VOCs as we call them, that can be produced from burning the epoxy resin. So I have a little video here, and it's the making of a river table. And I'm just going to start playing it here and give it a watch. All right, here we go. You can see in the top there, he's mixing the two products together. He does have gloves on. And there's the product here. It looks like he's just smoothing it out. He's using it to fill in all those little imperfections in the wood. So here's his actual table. That's his mold there that he has in the middle, and you can see him on the right starting to pour the liquid into the area that he wants it to fill. So it's going to take the shape that he made there. And you can actually see the bubbles that are forming on the surface there, pouring it. So in this case, he's got a heat gun probably to help it dry and cure. And here we are. He looks like he's sanding it down. Looks like he's doing a lot of sanding of this. Note he's doing it outside. Looks like quite a bit of sanding and polishing he's doing on it. Vacuuming up all the dust. And there's the finished product. Very nice. Finished table. There's your river table. Very cool. Okay.
So there are no occupational exposure limits for epoxies as a mixture or system. OSHA, NIOSH, ACGIH, or the Ministry of Labor Training and Skills Development they don't have any occupational exposure limits for the mixtures. However, there are limits for the individual components, if you will. For example, formaldehyde is one of the items that can be off-gassed during hazardous decomposition of the actual epoxy system. And so formaldehyde is a carcinogen, and there are occupational exposure limits for formaldehyde. So that's just one example. Other components of the systems include ethylenidiamine, very hard to pronounce, which is the volatile hardeners. Epichlorohydrin, it's part of the epoxy resin monomer. And bisphenol A, as most of us are familiar with, it's a skin sensitizer as well as a reproductive toxin. Epichlorohydrin itself is a group 2A IARC carcinogen, which is known to be probably carcinogenic to humans. Additional health effects include short-term, through short-term exposure, may include skin irritation and damage to the liver, kidneys and/or central nervous system. Long-term exposure may result in eye, skin, and stomach irritation, chromosomal aberrations, adverse changes in blood, and cancer. So epoxy resin systems are not something to take lightly. And this is why we felt it, again, it was very critical to share this information with you. Next.
All right, so we did look at some safety data sheets for the resin and hardener. So the main constituent of one of the ones that I looked at was this really long name copolymer. Um, and safety data sheets do include hazard statements. So knowing what's in it is fine, but then you have to keep reading the safety data sheet. Not all the information you need is going to be there, but these hazard statements in there are very important. Okay, because then you're going to take those and then you're going to control for those hazards. So this specific one, right on the safety data sheet, says causes skin irritation, may cause allergic skin reaction, serious eye irritation, respiratory irritation, harmful to aquatic life. Um, so it's really important to read these and know what you're working with. And the hardener, again, really long chemical name. The hazard is statement on that, harmful if swallowed. Hopefully no one's swallowing it on purpose, but it can cause severe skin burns and serious eye damage. So again, really important to review the safety data sheets. So we saw in the video the final product. So that was a completely cured epoxy resin. That poses very few health risks. Um, However, we did see the guy sanding it down, which produces dust, which, should not be inhaled. And we did see him move through different uh, types of sandpaper polishing. So there was a lot of fine dust that was created. And then he was obviously also sanding down the wood. So you get the mix of the resin dust and the wood dust, neither of it which you want to inhale.
So the various health hazards from epoxy use include contact dermatitis or allergic dermatitis when we speak of sensitization, and I'll explain that in a few minutes, chemical burns, respiratory irritation and or sensitization, and photodermatitis. So when we speak about sensitization, we're not saying that somebody is sensitive to the use of epoxies. When we speak of sensitization, we're saying that there is an actual immune response to the exposure. So it's a lot more intense, if you will. If somebody is sensitized to something in the epoxy mixture, continued exposure will cause them to have more and more severe reactions to the exposure. So the best means of of preventing the exposure or future exposure is to cease the exposure. You have to move the worker away, or if you're working at home with this, you have to stop working with the particular agents. Even if you have personal protective equipment in place, and you've already been sensitized, it is likely that you will still have an exposure because even a minute amount of exposure will cause a reaction. So it's very serious when one becomes sensitized to any agent in the workplace that could cause sensitization. Next. So when we speak about sensitization, just to further emphasize this fact, according to the Mayo Clinic, sensitization from irritant exposure in the workplace can be classified as occupational asthma if it's respiratory. So sometimes sensitizers can cause both respiratory as well as skin reactions. Or sometimes it's just singular. It's either just a respiratory or as a skin reaction. But of late, it's been discovered that formaldehyde, for example, can cause both skin and respiratory reactions. Occupational asthma itself can cause symptoms such as chest tightness, wheezing, and shortness of breath. So the reactions or the end result are quite serious. Furthermore, the Mayo Clinic states Two of the high-risk occupations for developing occupational asthma are adhesive handlers and users of plastics and epoxy resins. Again, this is why we wanted to emphasize this particular webinar for you. Next. So with regards to contact dermatitis, seizing exposure can stop the dermatitis. However, chronic exposure can cause chronic contact dermatitis. So it's not a sensitization issue, it's just a continued exposure. You'll continue to have the dermatitis. But if you stop the exposure, the dermatitis should rectify along with help, medical help, etc., creams, etc. Partially cured epoxy sanding dust exposure on the skin can also lead to contact dermatitis. In terms of allergic dermatitis, you may become sensitized after one exposure or many exposures to the epoxy. It's hard to determine. It all depends on the individual immune response. Allergic reactions result in skin or respiratory issues of sensitization, as already mentioned. Next.
All right, respiratory irritation, just continuing on here. So breathing in the vapor can cause irritation of the respiratory system. So in the video, if you remember, he was pouring both the mixtures into a small little container, but there is instances where they're mixing larger amounts, which would equal a larger amount of vapor, and that's not something you want to breathe in. Also, breathing in partially cured sanding dust can cause irritation as the epoxy chemicals remain reactive until they're fully cured. So this is where you'd want to go back to the instructions of it and look for the cure time, because it may seem cured or dried to the touch, but it's not actually fully cured. Especially when it comes to sanding, where you're going to be sanding that layer on top that's seems dry, but then you're creating dust from the layer that's underneath. So what happens here is the particles can be trapped in the mucus lining of the respiratory system, and the reactive material can cause severe respiratory irritation or allergies. And definitely epoxy spraying should be avoided. We saw the guy just pouring it, which is fine, but there's never really any circumstances where you should be spraying that epoxy. So spraying should be avoided at all times because you don't want to make that epoxy airborne, and then it's an inhalation hazard. So chemical burns, the epoxy hardeners are moderately corrosive and can cause moderate burns. However, the burns are less severe when you have the resin and hardener mixed together. They're less corrosive. In either case, you should be careful. So here's the hierarchy of controls that all of our hygienists love. So if we start at the top, elimination, this is the most preferred method. And then as we go down, substitution, this is where you could replace the hazard. There is no replacement or substitution for these chemicals as of yet. They are what they are, and there's no replacement. So since there's no replacement, we move into engineering controls, and we're going to get into specific examples of these. But we can talk about ventilation here, isolation of people from the hazard, administrative controls, changing the way people work, or doing things in a different time or a different space from other workers doing different tasks. That way you're not exposing everyone to the hazard. And last but not least, personal protective equipment, and then we are going to go through what first PPE is needed for some of these tasks. So here's a couple examples for ventilation, specifically for epoxy fumes. So the one on the left here, this guy is working under a fume hood. Obviously, this is only fine for small pieces that are being worked on. But basically the vapors stay in that hood, and there's a fan and filters in that top section box, and they're captured, and then the worker is not exposed to those fumes. The other one here on the right, this is a fume or dust extractor. So this is nice and portable, and you can move that hood around so that it captures the vapors right at the source, so then it eliminates that exposure. The vapors are transported through that black ductwork into the box where there's a fan, and a filter again captures all of them. So that fumes or dust are not in the air, they're contained in that white box there. As far as administrative controls go, you can limit access to work areas. If someone's pouring the epoxy, you can, do it in a separate room, or do it at times when no other workers are around. And another thing here that's important is training of workers on the health effects. Whether you're doing this yourself, or with one other worker, or even a small, everyone should know the hazards of everything they're working with. And the last thing on here is, you could, if possible, schedule work as far away from dust generating processes as possible. So you can either, if you're doing something that's creating a lot of dust, have a space for it, or do it at a time when there's less people in that specific area. That way they're not exposed. So you're reducing the number of people that are exposed.
Personal protective equipment. So what's recommended is to have safety goggles or a face shield to protect your skin and your eyes from exposures. Gloves. In terms of gloves, usually the SDS should provide specifics with regards to what should be utilized, but in lieu of that, if they aren't provided, nitrile or butyl rubber gloves are recommended for work with epoxies, and leather and canvas gloves we recommend when working with wood to prevent splinters, etc. In terms of respiratory equipment, you should be wearing a respirator. Refer to the safety data sheet. If the safety data sheet isn't specific enough, then you should be speaking with the supplier of the epoxy, and they can actually give you further information as to what kind of respirator you should be working with. An apron is also recommended. A canvas apron with plastic on top, or a PVC apron would work with these systems. And we added in here hearing protection, especially when working with the powered equipment or wood cutting or whatnot, when preparing for these tables, etc., and the mold, etc. So yeah, these are generally the types of things that you would want to invest in for working and protecting your health and safety with epoxy systems.
So this is concludes our presentation for today. Thank you for attending and listening. On this last slide here, I've included my email address as well as Sonia's, so feel free to contact us with any questions. If you
Yes,
can
and
visit, go
sorry,
ahead.
James, I just wanted to plug in here with regards to the podcasts. OCAL has started a new series of podcasts, so you can listen to health and safety information, how to protect your health at work or your workers' health while you're on the go. So please have a look at our podcasts as well, and other items on our website, which is currently under construction, but have a look at www.ocal.on.ca. Thank you.